Welcome to Calm Your Caveman, a podcast where we study the tools for anxiety mastery. I'm your host, Dr. Adriana Jarvis Twitchell, a specialist in anxiety mastery strategies. Hi, welcome back to our two-part series, the interview with Dr. Thomas W. Nielsen, where he is talking to us about finding the keys to meaningful happiness. Again, we are discussing in more depth what it means to find your why and how we apply this on a practical level. In this part of the interview, Dr. Nielsen goes into more detail about the different dimensions of giving, how that includes giving to yourself, what healthy giving looks like, what it doesn't look like, and really gives us some important insights into how giving can be a strategy that gives us a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, which of course will then affect our anxiety levels. He talks more in depth about how this affects our well-being in general. I know that you'll enjoy his insights in this second half of the interview. So here it is. Please do tell us a little bit about those categories of self-care. What are these things that we need to be aware of, that we have limits in these areas and we need to nurture something in order to have a reservoir to give from?
Absolutely. So I can quickly introduce them. Each of them is a study on their own, of course, and there's tons of research backing up these. That's why I've chosen them. Actually, I didn't invent them. For example, I didn't invent sleep, as you can imagine. I didn't invent exercise. All I've invented in a way to help myself initially, and I found later on that teachers and anyone who's interested seems to also sort of think it's a useful little acronym. All I invented was this acronym that contains this little collection of evidence-based areas that we need to look after in order to look after ourselves. So the acronym, if you're listening, is self-care aims. And it's a long acronym, but once you've done it a couple of times, it's not so hard to remember it. And sometimes when I'm not near my computer, sometimes I'm on a trip and whatever, in my diary, I just write down self-care aims and I go tick, tick. Oh, I'm a little bit behind with this. I need to catch up with that. And so it's a quick little way that you can catch up. So self-care aims, if you were listening and you wanted to write it down, you could write it down vertically. And we can also, of course, put a link into this later on. But S is for sleep. Most people need 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and it's important to think about the sleep. And sleep is a huge problem in a modern day age for young people as well, because the light sources that we have and the social media and the phones and everything often takes us a little bit away from that time where we should be sleeping. E is for exercise. We have to exercise regularly. It doesn't matter so much what you do, as long as you get your heart rate up and you do it regularly and don't sit too much. L is two things for love. Love and laughter. Love is almost a bit of a synonym for the meaningful life that we're talking about. But now in relation to self-care, how does it apply to yourself, of course, specifically? So it includes sexuality and romantic love, of course, but it's also a lot broader because it asks the questions, have you spent enough time with your best friend of late? Because it does give you this sense of, if you don't want to call it love, unconditional positive regard, or this sense of feeling that this feeling, whatever we call it, we have with other people and other beings, animals as well, and nature even, love of nature. So is that love coming towards us in enough doses? Laughter, I often put in there because it fits with the L, but the research shows it's very healthy to have some laughter every day if we can. And of course, it's often something we do with our friends and our close ones. So it fits a little bit close together there. Love and laughter is for the L. F is for food, of course, again, just being a synonym for diet and hydration and all that comes with that. C is for creativity. Um, and think about that broadly, because it can be many things to different people. Like, I don't paint and don't do sort of normal creative things, but I do jujitsu, which also happens to be my exercise, but it's also very creative because, you're trying to not get in a Pringle yourself, and you're trying to put someone else in a Pringle. So it's very creative. Bruce Lee said, you have to express yourself honestly. And I feel like in jiu-jitsu, I express myself honestly. So it's almost like it fulfills a creative outlet in me, as well as in this case, the exercise. And that's one of the things we learn once we get better at this, that many of them that can overlap. So they fulfill many areas in our lives because we just love them, and they tend to fulfill other areas. There's two A's, then it doesn't matter which order is it, but one A is for autonomy. It's important to feel freedom, have a sense of control. And so if we have toxic relationships, we need to seriously think about how we can change that. If we have toxic work environments, we have to seriously think about how we can change that. And think about this broadly again, because I sometimes tell that it's interesting how some of the data on happiness historically has had some of the most dismal results from the old Soviet Union countries. And it is some of the lowest level of happiness, not necessarily the poorest countries always, because it's interesting that those countries in the former Soviet Union, they often had potatoes on the table and a roof over their head. But what of course they didn't have a lot of was autonomy, freedom, the fear of Big Brother watching over you, and so on. So you might say, well, what if you live in Brazil or you live in Australia? We don't have that problem, do we? Well, I beg to differ, because you can make yourself a slave to, let's say, the phone. Where's my phone? It's over there now. But you can make a slave to technology, to social media, to a lot of things, to your work very easily, even though it's self-imposed. So this idea of autonomy is really to think about all the levels where you just get a sense of freedom in your life. I have a motorcycle. And again, I say to my students sometimes that, that might be because I'm having midlife crisis, and that might be true as well. But I do think that I have the motorcycle because I also really love the freedom of just sort of flying through the wind. I have to go to work anyway, but if I can take the bike, I always take the bike, because it's my 15 minutes of freedom, wind flowing through my hair. Haven't got so much of it, but it gives me so much freedom and joy. What is your joy? Figure out follow your passion, so you can have this sense of freedom. I won't speak as much to all the other ones, because then it's all about that. But I think autonomy was worth just mentioning that, because that can be a little bit sort of ambivalent. The rest of them are quite easy to understand. Like, for example, the next one is for residence. It just means that we all need a place where we can come home and recharge our batteries and think about the day that has been, the day that's going to be tomorrow. So residence is just whether you live in a camper van or a big house and mansion is often not so important. The research tends to suggest that what seems to be important to all of us is there's a certain level of cleanliness, certain level of order, and then there's a little bit of aesthetic beauty to, bring up our spirit, whatever that aesthetic beauty is your preference. E is for the environment. And here I often think about the natural environment. Why is it that hospital patients need less pain medication if they have a tree outside their window as opposed to a brick wall? We don't really know from research why that is, but we just know that is the leaves out there on the trees have a very beneficial influence on our health. So think about, we're lucky where I live in Canberra because we're so close to nature. We can just drive 5 minutes and we're in the bush on the mountains or an hour to the sea. So, but not everyone does that. And so unless you take the opportunity to be in nature, we can be self-imposed in this prison, if you like. We're up to self-care. A is for, the other A is for achievement. most people are happiest if they achieve a little bit. So there can be big achievements like taking a degree or having a meaningful job, or it can be little achievements, just reading a good book, meaningful book while you're on holidays, lying on the beach or whatever it might be. But we're usually happiest if we have a little bit sense of having achieved things at the end of the day. So it's something worth considering in relation to our happiness. I is for income. So having said that, money doesn't make, after a very basic level, money doesn't make us happier, at least in terms of that deep, meaningful happiness that is of most importance, as opposed to the pleasurable happiness. It's really still important to consider that aspect, because it is a foundation. Unless we have that basic ability to look after ourselves and our loved ones, it does impinge very much on our happiness and sometimes health. We don't have those choices that come with having enough money. So it's a very important aspect to consider in our lives in order to be happy. M is also two things. It's from mindfulness and meditation. And I put them together because the research is just so clear that mindfulness is really important for our health. But if you're not necessarily ready for meditation, or you don't want to take that up, then mindfulness is something to consider in and of itself. But of course, meditation in many ways is just a very concerted and systematic way of exercising mindfulness. So it's something to consider in our lives. The more we can be mindful in everything, the healthier it seems to be for us. The last one is for study. And it's just, again, a synonym to help us remind us that the brain needs to be exercised as much as our muscles. And it's actually the same thing, use it or lose it. So even into old age, we know now that, challenging the brain, challenging our intellect can produce even new brain cells, even though many of them are also dying out in old age. It's the best way to stay vital and have good cognitive function into old age, is to continue to have this quest for extending your capabilities cognitively, and to extend, to learn and to study. And I often suggest studying yourself and study the world, because studying yourself in many ways, of course, is what the self-care acronym invites you to do. It's really important to know thyself in order to be able to function and contribute in the world. So sorry, that was a little bit of a long spiel, but it was as quick as an introduction. I quick to self-care aims, and we make a little link so people can study them and also adapt them to their own needs, because that's the last thing I just need to say whenever I introduce this little tool, and that is that everyone should be invited to adapt them to their own lives, because it cannot contain everything that perhaps you're passionate about. For example, you might say, "Oh, Thomas, where is gardening? I love gardening, and that makes me so happy." But I say, "Yeah, okay, maybe you can put it under the environment, your way of being in nature, or you can put it under exercise." Well, it doesn't really matter. You just, this idea that we can personalize it, and there's little sub-tabs under these main categories. Or you might say, "Where's jiu-jitsu on this self-care aims?" Because, I love jiu-jitsu. But I might say, "Oh yeah, maybe you could put it under exercise, because it can't really contain all types of exercise anyway." So there's always a bit of personalization that's needed. But I will say, to the best of my capabilities, those areas is a really good collection of a big pool in the research as to what is evidence-based and universal, it seems, for all of us, that we do need to have certain levels of that in order in our lives, in order to have the surplus with which to live the meaningful lives.
Oh, what a complete answer. I really appreciate that. That's really helpful.
You're welcome.
And I like your idea of just having the acronym there as you're traveling or whatever, and you can look and see how you're doing on these different levels, these different areas, and see which ones maybe you're not doing as well in.
That's exactly it, because a lot of people will say to me that, I was already doing well with this, I was aware of that, but there's usually, for all of us, there's like 2 or 3 or 4 areas that we haven't thought so much about and perhaps could be better in our lives. So that's usually what people say. That's interesting you say that.
I'm getting this idea of looking at your life as a sort of a stewardship that you need to care for yourself and you need to care for others, and you need to recognize that your physiology, your body, your brain has needs. You need to care for them.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk in your chapter a little bit about the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem, and
Mm.
this idea of this acronym of the areas of self-care seems to me like self-compassion, right? We're not looking in the
Mm.
mirror and saying, I'm so great.
Mm.
You're actually caring for yourself in these concrete ways. Can you talk a little bit more about that difference between
Yeah, and
self-esteem and self-compassion?
I think that's really important because you can imagine how, for example, I'm in education, so I often talk to teachers about it would be important. You can imagine to teach self-care aims together with this philosophy of the meaningful life, because then they
Mm-hmm.
really, really complement each other. You understand that it's not selfish to look after yourself because it's actually the only way that you can be something for others. But you can know
Mm-hmm.
that there can be a big difference between me getting up in the morning and looking in the mirror to beautify myself and go out
Mm-hmm.
in the world and hope that everybody will notice me and look at my
Mm-hmm.
latest fashion and so on. So
Mm-hmm.
there's ways of looking after yourselves in one way. And then there's ways where I get up in the morning, I put on some clothes so I feel good. I put on some porridge in my tummy so I feel happy and functioning and I can go out in the world. So that, it's both looking after self, but one is
Mm-hmm.
done with the philosophy of the meaningful life and one is done
Mm-hmm.
perhaps for more unconscious sort of selfish reasons. And we know, and there's no judgment in this, but I think we
Mm-hmm.
do need to we do need to educate the world that there is a research base that shows that one is a lot healthier than the other because then people have
Mm-hmm.
a choice. It empowers
Mm-hmm.
people to make a choice. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, I know from research in education that you often see this big change in students when they suddenly realize that I can look after myself, but it's really important I look after myself in a compassionate way, not in a
Mm-hmm.
necessarily just in a self-esteem way. Because coming back to your question, the research is quite interesting because self-esteem is all over the place when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to the research. People who are alcoholics and drug addicts and abusers, and also successful people can have high self-esteem. Self-esteem is no predictor of, of success in life in any
Mm-hmm.
capacity because it seems to be all over the place. In other words, there's another factor there. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
self-esteem. It's not just self-esteem. It has to be grounded in something else. Whereas if you look at the research in self-compassion, it is quite clear that when you have high levels of self-compassion, you have much higher levels of the things we are talking about in this program.
Mm-hmm.
Things like more meaning. You are more likely to contribute. You tend
Mm-hmm.
to be healthier. You tend to live longer. You tend to have more compassion for others as you have
Mm-hmm.
compassion for yourself. And we often grow up with these kind of sayings that you have to love yourself in order to love others. It
Mm-hmm.
actually seems like these old sort of perennial wisdom quotes are based on some evolutionary truth that we're now finding in the research to be true.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in the chapter you mentioned there, I remember I kind of set up this dichotomy, which sometimes is used, particularly in education, that, should we teach them skills or self-esteem? And in that chapter, I
Mm-hmm.
argue that, well, we kind of need self-esteem and we kind of need skills, but we also need something other than that. And that's to do with this other dimension, this values dimension that has to do with compassion, whether it's towards self and others. And when we
Mm-hmm.
get this third element into it, we suddenly realize that skills and self-esteem in themselves don't denote the kind of human being we want to be in most
Mm-hmm.
cases, or the kind of world we want to be. Because you can imagine how you can have all the skills in the world and all the self-esteem in the world, and you still is of little contribution to your fellow man or the planet. There's many dictators,
Mm-hmm.
past and present, that seems
Mm-hmm.
to have extremely high levels of self-esteem and also
Mm-hmm.
have skills on many levels, but again, don't seem to have that heart, that
Mm-hmm.
compassion, that
Mm-hmm.
benevolence, towards others. And in many cases, often we know from psychology, not towards themselves as well, because behind the bravado of extended and extreme self-esteem is often very low self-esteem. And once you start challenging that inflated balloon, of course, what you often experience is aggression and all sorts of efforts to try and protect that, because it's actually not supported by something substantial. So the difference between self-esteem and compassion is actually, it lies at the heart of a lot of our problems and challenges in the world, including the challenging of staying healthy and self-caring towards ourselves.
Yeah, and you really bring out this difference, this one crucial element, which is an element of love, right? Because it goes back to the title of your chapter, Beyond Being Happy or Sad, is to love. So this compassionate relationship with ourselves and with the others, with the world, that this is what leads us toward having a sense of meaning. But another thing that I really loved in your article was your discussion of giving as a principle of living. And because you talk about it more than just, having a to-do list where I'm going to go and do such and such for my neighbor. It's a principle of, it's a way of living. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting that all the major religions and many of the wisdom traditions throughout time, at the core of their message has always been the same message that we're talking about today. Christianity, love thy neighbor. Buddhism, be harmless to all things, even be careful not to step on the ants there under your shoe. The Quran, I'm told, in the Quran, it's a very central message that love is the quickest route to human perfection. Giving is the quickest route to human perfection. And I find it interesting that these major religions and spiritual traditions have basically at heart all said the same thing as what the research is showing now. And that just to me is a wonderful thing, because it shows that we have more in common than separates us. Yes, as human beings, we've certainly perverted religion in all sorts of ways, and we still do that in many ways that are detrimental for our own health and community as a global community. When we start, believing that we are more right than the other person, rather than just acknowledging the fact that at heart of all of these religious traditions is the same message, and then the diversity and the difference is much less in many ways, and not something we have to get up in arms about. And even if you're non-religious, I think it's again showing that it's a wonderful way we can have common ground on which to proceed. And I often say to my students and to other people that I'm very happy to have these philosophical discussions about where giving comes from, whether it's an evolutionary trait or it's a spiritual characteristic of us. But I think as an educator and as a researcher, I say that that's well and true and good to have these discussions, and I personally find them very fascinating. But in terms of practical going forward, it's even more important to recognize that we actually know how to go forward, whether or not we know from whence this mysterious, to some degree, the mysterious thing comes. I love Buddha, that there's a story of Buddha where he says, if you're hit by an arrow, don't stop and ponder, I wonder from whence that arrow came. Obviously, attend to the wound and rather than philosophically wonder too much about from whence it came. It's not a perfect analogy, but it does illustrate the same concept that we don't know from whence this gift comes of giving, but we do know in which directions to go with it. And that is probably the more important thing to alleviate the suffering that we all have on different levels, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is an intelligent, aware human being on this planet that don't have some levels of anxiety, because it would be unwise not to. It's almost like the crisis we have in the natural environment, the political division, the social division, the polarity that has come also from social media, and being able to be confirmed in your own bias much more now than it was in the past. We have
Mm-hmm.
certain problems that are more prominent now, and that
Mm-hmm.
needs solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So to not be anxious on some level, I think, is putting your head in the sand to
Yeah.
some degree. So we have to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge and recognize that we are all in the same boat to
Mm-hmm.
the same degree. And having a principle of giving, I think, takes us not out of anxiety completely, but it brings us into a healthy state where we do something about it. And that's coming back to this thing about meaning and contributing. That's something around, if we work for solutions, we can handle being with a problem, and we can handle that there are problems around us. It's almost
Mm-hmm.
like the solution comes from within, from our parasympathetic dominance, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes us have. I might just quickly share another. Now that we mentioned Buddha,
Please.
there's another book.
Uh-huh.
There's another Buddhist saying that I also love, and that is, you can't cover the whole world in soft and smooth leather to make your journey soft and smooth, but you can wear leather sandals.
Hmm.
And I
Mhm.
love it because it's a funny concept. Can you imagine? Oh, there's an angry person. Let me put some soft leather around him or her, or
Uh-huh.
them.
Uh-huh.
There's a sharp corner in the world. Let me put some. You would run out of soft leather very quick.
Mhm.
But this idea that in this little space of the universe called Thomas, I can have
Mhm.
leather sandals, so that
Mhm.
at least wherever I'm walking, there's a certain type of equilibrium, even if I'm dealing with a world that hasn't got equilibrium. I can have that to a certain extent because I have power over my own choices, and I have
Mhm.
power over my own emotions. I have power over my own thoughts. It's, in some ways, it's the only thing I have power over, but it's
Exactly.
actually also in many ways the only thing I have power over. But it's also the only thing that actually is needed to have this sustainable happiness, if circumstances indeed is only a small part of it, and our state of being is the more important contributor to our health and
Mhm.
happiness. So a principle of giving in terms as a principle of life is something that I myself is fascinated about. I'm trying to live every day in many ways. And sometimes it has nothing to do with overt or physical giving. Sometimes it has more to do with being silent and mediative and being within. And
Mhm.
sometimes it has to do with active participation and help of others in the world. But it's almost
Mhm.
like it's got less to do with the actual action and more to do with my state of being.
Mm.
I find, and
Mhm.
again, seems to be corroborated with the research.
Yeah, and you mention in the chapter as well that as part of that, that gratitude can be a method of giving. Can you
That's
talk
an
a little bit about
example.
that?
Yeah. I think that's an example of how it can be ephemeral, if you like, or it can be non-physical, because research shows that if I just ask you to, let's just together sit for 5 minutes and think about something we're grateful for, again, statistically speaking, people will increase their levels of parasympathetic dominance, their levels of synchronicity in their body, their levels of happiness and health inside of them. And it doesn't really matter what you think about, that's just the emotion of gratitude, which to me, in many ways, is just a giving emotion, whether it's directed towards others or yourself. It's just a positive emotion. All positive emotions in many ways are giving emotions. So I think the gratitude research shows in many ways this idea of giving can be subtle acts, if you like, of feeling and doesn't have to always be manifest in action. And also interesting, I find it interesting that some psychologists talk about how sometimes your non-action is the best way to help, And as a teacher, I remember students coming up to me and say, "Isn't this beautiful, Mr. Nielsen?" And then I remember sometimes knowing the student, I felt the best response was, "I think you know yourself." And they go, "Yeah, I did a lot of effort on this. So yeah, it's good. Yeah." That's probably what I would say as well. So, sometimes holding back is actually the most giving thing. But again, it illustrates this idea that giving has something to do with wise living, not just this list, as you say, of I got to do this. And so coming back to the question you started with, there's no need to feel anxious about listening to or talking about the idea of giving, because that buys into old negative fear-based beliefs around what we must do and what we should do and what perhaps we've inherited from our parents, or we inherited from our school, or we inherited from our society, or from many generations of living. It's also a principle of living by giving is also an invitation to start living in a way where we know ourselves in a very deep and profound way and examine all our beliefs, because all our fears are situated in there, and they need to be. We cannot transform what we cannot see. We have to bring it to the forefront of our consciousness for them to be transformed. And that in itself is a giving thing that you could do to yourself. But you can see it becomes much more complex, much more exciting, and much more multifaceted, and much more existing on many, many, many levels than just giving money to the Salvos or the Salvation Army or something else. So I love that you asked that question, because it's so important to realize, in order not to be anxious about being told that the giving is really healthy for you, because there's so much more to it. There's a wisdom that has to be understood and worked with in order to make this sort of fruitful in your life.
Yeah, that's really important. And I like how in your list of self-care aims, you include autonomy, because for me personally, I feel like I love to give something that is my idea. It's something that I wanted to do, but if I feel like it's imposed on me from outside, it's harder for me. It doesn't feel like it gives me the same benefits. So I like keeping that awareness in there, that autonomy is one thing that can make giving beneficial to
We know
yourself and to
now that
others.
Absolutely. We know now that the best leaders, the best CEOs, the best teachers, anyone who has some responsibility, the best parents are the ones who can help their children, their students, their workers, their collaborators, whatever it might be, to do what it is that needs doing, but in a way where they feel ownership and agency.
Yeah.
So the more you can sort of feel as if you're not directing them to do this, but this is something that they are part of choosing. And there's many ways of doing that. That's why they're the best leaders and best teachers, because it does take wisdom to do that with students. It does take wisdom to do that with your children. It does take wisdom to do that in a workplace where you might be the supervisor or you might be the boss. But there's still many different ways of doing that, where you can either feel as if your autonomy is being eroded, or your autonomy is actually being encouraged. And in business, of course, this has also become a philosophy in business, because they realize that, again, the research shows that businesses that incorporate some of these elements with their workers tend to have more productivity, more creativity, more happiness in that. There's, of course, all other elements of that too that needs to be factored in, like, you can't work them to death and you have to give them. But it's not all about the outcome, and it's not about the product and so on. But in fact, that's also why this principle of giving needs to be taken into all areas of life, including the economy, because it's interesting how we've been operating by an economy that's not based on research, but a theory that, that what is the dominant theory that, everything will adjust itself by according to demands and supply.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Mm-hmm.
already know that has failed. The global financial crisis was an example of that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people spend more money than they have to spend. Sometimes they spend money that's not theirs to spend unless there is some sort of value, some sort of ethics, some sort of philosophy guiding even our economy. It doesn't make much sense. Tim Jackson, by the way, if anyone is interested, is someone to look at when it comes to almost like a giving philosophy inside of economy, because he says it doesn't make much sense to have the economy that we have, because we live on a finite planet with finite resources. Having a constant economic growth is philosophically debunked. Instead, he said we should actually think about when is enough, and how can we make sure that everyone has something, and not someone having, a few percentage of people on this planet has 40% of the wealth on the planet. That makes absolutely no sense. And it can only happen inside of philosophy that's very different from this giving philosophy, I feel. So there's a whole transformation of society that's needed. But I think what we talked about today is certainly, at least, I can't see how that is not essential for those discussions in order to transport us towards a society that has more of that philosophy rather than what is currently giving us many of these challenges that we see.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that in. It really helps us to see the extent of the possibilities of living in this way if we can do it as a group. But I really appreciate your understanding of this principle, first of all, just to teach us how it benefits us, but then to also help us understand what it is and what it isn't, and how we can do it in a way that actually is healthy, because there is a way to do it in a way that is unhealthy, right? And to understand all of the different ways that it can be expressed and manifest. This has just been really, really helpful. It's better than I hoped. I'm really thankful that you
I'm glad.
were willing to come today and talk to us about this.
It's been my pleasure, and it's been a gift to my parasympathetic dominance to be able to help you. Yes.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
And just reminding any music lovers, I want to invite you to a concert that I'll be playing with my quartet, the Avery Ensemble, in West Hartford, Connecticut, on Saturday, October 5th. Any of you in the New England area, would love to meet you in person. If you want to find out more about the concert, about our ensemble, about buying tickets, go to averyensemble.com. Thanks for joining me today. If you feel like you'd benefit from individual anxiety coaching, you can look me up on my website, calmyourcaveman.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do that by subscribing to Calm Your Caveman on YouTube and also on your favorite podcast platform. And if you want to help other people find this podcast, leaving a good review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really helps. Thanks, and see you next time.